I'm sometimes asked, how did you get into Tibetan Buddhism? And I can actually remember the very first morning that I first encountered the Dharma. I was about 17 at the time and at home, and I was studying for a public exam, and my mum had been invited across the road to a ladies' coffee morning. And because everyone knew I was at home studying, I had been invited too. And I guess I was invited more out of politeness than anything else. But given that chocolate cake was on offer, and it's one of my favourites, who was I to refuse? So I thought I'll go across and have some chocolate cake before coming home to resume my studies. So I walked into this room full of middle-aged ladies, and interestingly enough, there's one lady who was actually in her 70s, directly across the room from me, and the moment I saw her, our eyes connected, and I felt an amazing sense of connection. I can't explain why, but that was just the way it was. And so Kay and I, I quickly found that was her name, she suggested we go for a walk in the orchard, which was quite a relief for me to get out of that room full of women. So off we went, there's just two of us, through the orchard, and she started telling me stories. And in particular, one was about the story of how she went to Tibet. This is in the early 1950s, long before the Chinese invasion. And it was a big undertaking, moving from London to Lhasa, in the day, long before the days of long distance travel. And she was really hoping that she'd have an opportunity to discuss a very personal matter with the Lama, because she had heard that the Tibetan Lamas were clairvoyant and had these amazing abilities, and she really wanted to spend some one-on-one FaceTime, as we call it now, with the Lama. So off they went when they got to Lhasa, to one of the major monasteries, and they were shown around it, and she was really seriously hoping for an opportunity to speak to a Lama, but it never actually happened because the small group of tourists she was with were kind of shepherded through the monastery and then into a courtyard where they had a question and answer session. Actually, I've got a photograph of Kay right here. I'm not sure whether you can see it. That was Kay and I when I visited her many years later. Anyway, so at the end of this trip through the monastery, there's a Q&A session, and there are a number of lamas who are standing around this little group of tourists watching with some interest as the process unfolded. But she didn't have this opportunity to speak to any one of them privately, but the question was very much top of mind for her. And as the group was shown out of the monastery gates, she felt quite disappointed that she hadn't had the opportunity she'd been so desperately hoping for. But as they were going out, one of the guys who'd been translating all this time came over and he drew her to one side. And a lama who'd been watching the entire proceedings came to the two of them, and through the translator he said to Kay, "The answer to your question is," and he proceeded to tell her. And the moment she told me that story, it was like it sent a shiver down my spine, and I thought, this is amazing. Since then, of course, I've got to know that Tibetan Buddhism has got to do with a lot more than clairvoyant lamas, but that was the very first time I'd heard anything about it, and from the first moment, I was completely hooked.